McDonnell as well, just ahead of the programme. I asked him too how he'd be commemorating Remembrance Day.
I'll be meeting up with the local scouts and guides and some of our veterans in the local park, and then we walk in procession down to our local church, have a service there which is always packed out, and then we go to the cenotaph and lay wreaths.
It's a day when we are commemorating the dead in many a conflicts. If we look ahead in terms of policy, can you just sum up for us how, in a nutshell, do you believe that security and military engagement policy would change when and if Labour comes to power?
Well, we are commemorating the dead and those who served as well, but we're also offering our support as well for those who serve at the moment too. So it's important for those that serve at the moment to just keep us safe and secure, that they have the equipment to do so and they're properly invested in our defence services, and that's what we'll make sure happens. And we'll hope to do that on a cross-party basis as well. We've got to ensure that we, as a country, can defend ourselves and we make our contribution worldwide. But one of the key differences in policy, I think, is that we'll be emphasising conflict prevention and conflict resolution. We've got to be wiser in how we prevent conflicts in the future. We analyse where those conflicts might arise, intervene much earlier in terms of trying to overcome those conflicts, and then when conflicts arise, resolve them more speedily and more effectively than we've done. That means international cooperation. It means a lot more investment, I think, in organisations like the UN, so that we can work out where the conflicts will come. We've got to be smarter and much more interventionist at an earlier stage than we are at the moment.
Yeah, and does that leave open the possibility, the willingness, in principle at least, of military engagement, military intervention? We know, obviously, your position on the Iraq conflict, of course, but in future, in principle?
There'll always be. Look, I come from a family where my father served in the army as a sergeant in the army in the Second World War. My grandfather was in the First World War. I come up from a family where the family understands when you have to intervene, when there's necessary. It also understands when it's best not to as well, and how you can resolve conflicts is the way in which we want to go forward. But there'll always be a necessity, if necessary, to save lives for intervention. Of course there will be.
Yeah, I mean Jeremy Corbyn has said, and I don't doubt you agree, that the last war, the Second World War, was an intervention against the Nazi regime in Germany, and that was clearly a defensible position, and more than defensible. Today, though, you have other questions. Britain's a member of NATO, which the Charter of NATO requires members to militarily engage, to go into battle if any NATO partner is attacked, and you absolutely stick to that principle.
Well, we've said we're members of NATO and we stick to that principle, but what we also do, what we want to ensure, is NATO is effective in conflict prevention and conflict resolution as well. I think we can, as a government, I think we'll bring to the peace a different direction in the way that you resolve those conflicts. And if you look at the nature of the conflicts that will be in the future, it will be about natural resources again. And again, if we can look at the issues around, people don't seem to recognise that climate change could be one of the major sources of conflict in the future. That's why you've got to link all these policies together in the long term.
Yeah, I mean, you stand by membership of NATO, but if, let us say, hypothetically, the forces of Vladimir Putin were to attack or threaten a NATO partner, Britain would be prepared to go into battle, not just support diplomatically or in terms of supply or backup, but go into battle in defence of that threatened partner. That is clearly the position, yeah?
As soon as you get into that sort of dialogue, you're not preventing conflict, you're exacerbating the situation.
So you wouldn't be prepared to give that guarantee?
No, we've given the guarantee that we'll abide by our membership of NATO. Of course we will. But what I'm saying to you, John, is the style of our approach in the future will be about conflict resolution. As soon as you get into that sort of conflict, if so-and-so strikes so-and-so, you're immediately you're up in the problems that we've got. You're up in the ante. That's not the style we'll have. We'll always.
It may not be Britain's choice. It may not be the choice of NATO.
We've always said we'll abide by our NATO commitments. We're parts of NATO. But what we're trying to say is, we think as we move into the modern era, not just us, I think this has now become almost consensual, the focus will be on conflict prevention and conflict resolution. But of course we'll always abide by our NATO commitments.
Just moving on in the time that we've got, one or two issues in the news. When it comes to the Paradise Papers story, is it your view that the British government in some way owes an apology to the people of this country?
I think so, because, look, I've been part of the tax justice campaign now since its foundation, over a decade ago, and we've been arguing for a long period of time. And as Shadow Chancellor over the last 2 years, I've been asking for a greater a greater emphasis on openness and transparency and enforcement with regard to tax evasion, but also closing down the loopholes of tax avoidance. And I don't think the government's done enough. Now, the government will boast, they've brought in large sums, etc. But we now know from both Pienaar and from the Paradise Papers, the scale, it's an industrial scale of tax avoidance that the government hasn't addressed. And if you're in a country where a government's been telling you austerity has been necessary for the last 7 years, and you've had, well, we've seen it today, waiting lists in our hospitals now, 500% increase in the number of people who are waiting long hours before they're treated, cuts in our schools, benefit cuts, etc. When you've been told you've got to make those sacrifices, then you realise actually the super rich are avoiding their taxes, and as a result of that, we're going through austerity to a large extent. Understandably, people are angry and they want action from the government, and they believe that the government hasn't done enough.
Is not, though, for the sake of argument, offshore investment an absolutely intrinsic part of the international financial system? The Labour Party, it is said, rents its headquarters from a company with an offshore base. Your own pension, I've seen reported, Westminster Council, you've declared it absolutely fully. That pension and many other people's pensions around the country, that involves investment offshore. Are you going to cut these links as Shadow Chancellor and then Chancellor? Absolutely. Can that be done? Do you propose that?
Yeah, take my pension. You know about my pension because I publish my income tax returns.
Yeah.
I want others to do that as well, and I want the super rich to publish their returns as well, so that we can identify what's going on. With my pension, it's administered by Westminster Council, Tory Council, regulated by a Tory government, and I'm in my union, Unison, I'm a member of Unison. We've been campaigning to say you shouldn't be using the offshore accounts. We want more openness and transparency and more democratic control over our investments in the future.
But as Chancellor, would you do anything about that?
We would. Yes, we would.
What would you do about offshore investment?
The most important thing is sunlight, the disinfectants of sunlight. So you ensure that there's openness and transparency. So you can see, for example, in trusts, that the beneficiaries of those trusts are actually publicly known, and you know how they operate, and that not just in this country but also in the overseas territories as well. If we can get openness and transparency, in that way we can have proper legislation that will tackle these issues effectively.
Should Labour be renting property from an offshore related business?
Well, I don't think we should have any dealings with offshore businesses until they pay their taxes. But to do that, you have to have openness and transparency, so you know exactly what's going on. But also, once you've done that, then you can take the legislative action to ensure all of those companies pay their taxes effectively.
But I guess when it comes to the Labour Party, you can decide now where you're going to rent your
that's
base.
Exactly what we've been saying. We've been lobbying to say whatever company anyone is involved in should be open, transparent, and they should be paying their taxes effectively. But the problem with all of this, and it's the same as, the Queen has been dragged into this. The problem with all of this, it's permeated the whole economy, and we've got to get back to where actually people can have confidence in government, democratic controlling tax avoidance on this industrial scale that we've got at the moment. And it just demonstrates, literally, right the way across our economy now, this culture has got to be tackled.
It's John McDonnell, the Shadow Chancellor, talking to me just ahead of the programme, and Anthony Seldon listening to that.